אחר צהריים טובים לכם. אנחנו מתחילים. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Game of Thrones, the global arena, our discussion for the next hour. After an agonizing wait, on July 7th, the new season of Game of Thrones will arrive, and as a science fiction and old school fantasy aficionado, I can hardly wait. So when I was asked to moderate the panel Games of Thrones, that's the name, the global arena, I accepted with pleasure. Of course, the name has got almost nothing to do with the discussion itself. People just want to bring in young audience, I presume. That's the number these days. There are some differences, to be sure, between Westeros and our present world, not all of them in our favor. Think of Air Force made of dragons, for one hand, or better yet, leaders actually going to combat and risking their lives, not just sending others to do their fight for them. But that's a different matter. This is not the point, and we are here today to talk about the global arena at present, and perhaps, and even more important for the discussion, talk about the future. So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you the participants today. Dr. Celeste Wallander, President, U.S.-Russia Foundation, former Special Assistant to President Barack Obama, and Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia in the National Security Council. Ambassador Sir John Jenkins, Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, Middle East, and Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, a former National Security Advisor of India, Distinguished Fellow, Brookings Institute. So first, and I'd like each one of them to bring about in a few minutes his credo about the situation today. Dr. Wallander, if you please.
Thank you very much. As a similar aficionado, I've read all 5 books, watched all 6 seasons, and can't wait to get back to the U.S. to watch the 7th season. I loved the title. I do want to...
And you do hold your fingers crossed for the good health of Mr. George R.R. Martin, who is 65, 66, and is not looking very good.
And we're hoping for the last
yes.
2 books, yes, of course. So I want to make 2 points to open and look forward to the discussion. One is that scholars debate endlessly, it seems, about the sources of conflicts, primarily in the 20th century. And they usually come down into one of 3 camps when you think about the geopolitical terrain. And the 3 kind of debates are the conflicts, were the conflicts of the 20th century, and therefore the conflicts to worry about in the 21st century, did they arise out of imbalances of power, a new rising power challenging the existing order and the existing powers? And that's one interpretation, certainly of World War I. And the second sort of model is usually known as sort of the instability and insecurity, the disintegration and uncertainty that arose from the end of colonialism or changes in empires, which is the second interpretation of the origins of World War I. And then the third usual interpretation that's offered to explain the major conflicts of the 20th century is a revanchist power, a declining power that is unhappy with its situation and seeks to reestablish its situation, and in doing so launches or precipitates conflicts, often conflicts that it loses, but nonetheless in an effort to reestablish itself and to fight back against the losses that it perceives it has been suffering to reestablish its power. And as I was thinking about the current terrain and the debates we have, because I heard earlier, I think it was Phil Gordon who said he doesn't like ranking threats because it's sort of comparing apples to oranges. And from an American perspective, we actually replicate this debate right now. Is the big geopolitical story of the current world the rise of China? And whether China's rise will be peaceful and will be moderated and accommodated by the international institutional global order? Or do the largest threats to the United States, at least, and I think to much of the world, arise from areas of instability, of changing or the legacies of empire, sectarian conflict, interethnic conflict. And obviously this is a major concern in the United States because of the focus on the sources of where terrorist threats, at least to the United States, arise. And I need not go any further talking to this group of experts on your own security environment here in the Middle East. But what I wanted to point out, as someone who's followed Russia for some time and who's had to try to make sense of what Russia is and what the challenges it poses, is that Russia really does fit that third model. A angry, former great power, still a major power, still a major regional power, but a power that doesn't have the global reach of its past, in its former Russian imperial past, but also in its Soviet past, that has a long list of grievances, much as the Nazi Germany did, that became part of the fuel that drove Germany to World War II, and that is seeking to reestablish its status and its position and have its power status recognized on the global scene. And if you look at Russian military intervention, less Georgia in 2008, but certainly Ukraine in 2014 and the ongoing intervention in Ukraine, and certainly the adventure in Syria, which is ongoing and which is very impressive and certainly is a good bid towards establishing that kind of Russian power. You kind of see that challenge, and that's how we frame it, or many of us frame it in the United States. And so I think the good news is scholars will continue to debate. The bad news is that policymakers actually have to deal at the same time in this geopolitical landscape with all three sources, classic sources of conflict. And I think that's the big challenge for policymakers. It's not how to do one or the other, it's how to do all three at the same time. And I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Jenkins.
Thanks very much. I watched Game of Thrones as well. I mean, the three things about Game of Thrones that distinguish it from most other series, as I was saying earlier, are violence, dragons, and sex. And in the end, I got bored with the violence and the dragons. So I stopped watching it. The one way in which it overlaps with what we see around the world, particularly in this region, but not just in this region, is the violence. Which is as intense now, perhaps more intense than it has been at any point in the modern history of the Middle East, essentially since the end of the First World War, when these states were created. And I should say most of the states of the Middle East were not created. And I say this all the time because I feel a responsibility to say it, because of Sykes-Picot. They emerged out of a set of very complex negotiations after the end of the Second World War, in which Russia and Turkey played a massively important role. And I think one of the other things when I look around the world that strikes me is how far liberals in particular continue to be surprised by the recurrence of ideology. There was a time, I think, maybe 10 years ago, when people thought ideologies had gone, that all you were left with was a set of managerial problems for states and countries. Well, that turns out not to be true. Ideology never went away, and it is recrudesced, or various ideologies are recrudesced in various distorted and often toxic forms.
And even more so, if I may interrupt, nationalism. I remember good old Europeans smile at me condescendingly and explain to us, poor natives of the Middle East, nationalism is gone.
I agree entirely. And I should say on that note, and maybe anticipating what I'm going to say at the very end, is that there really is no substitute for the nation state. At the same time, the nation state is subject to two very serious challenges at the moment. One is from various in this region, particularly various forms of Islamism, and I'm very happy to talk about that at greater length. And Islamism is by definition a transnational ideology which favors the interests of some imaginary transnational sacralized community over the community contained within the nation-state borders. And the other is, of course, the rise of China. I think the two things pose different challenges to what people talk about as the global order, the global international order. Now, if you think about the global international order, and people talk about Westphalia, the Westphalian system. The Westphalian settlement of 1648 was essentially a legal and security settlement. It allowed for the settlement of disputes within the Holy Roman Empire by a combination of using institutions of the empire and by emerging international law. What it wasn't was an economic order, and it wasn't a liberal social order. the liberal social order and the economic order, the global economic order, are products of 1945 to 1950. One of the striking things we saw in the so-called Arab Spring here, or after, as a result of the Arab Spring, was what I call a flight to security. We saw it in Egypt. One of the reasons the Sisi remained so popular in Egypt is because Egyptians did not want what they saw as the chaos emerging from the highly ideological misgovernance of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they fled to security. We've seen this in Tunisia. We would see it in Syria, I think, if given half a chance, and we would see it in Libya. And you see it in the states of the Gulf. When I first came to the Middle East, when I first was posted to the Middle East in 1983, my first posting was Abu Dhabi. Everyone in those days said the Gulf states are backward, tribal. To paraphrase or to quote Khomeini, they were the camel herders of Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and so forth. You look now, and power has shifted from the great republican powers of the Arab North to the Gulf. And this isn't simply about money, it's also about organization, and it's about security. It's about giving people a chance to lead a different life. Now, these challenges are not unique to the Middle East. I think about the Middle East, about the Arab Spring, from 2010 onwards, from when Bouazizi set himself alight in Tunisia. And what looked at the time like a set of populist insurgencies which were specifically Arab now look like simply the earliest harbinger of a set of populist insurgencies which we've seen globally. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in the United States, perhaps with Donald Trump. We've seen it in the UK with Brexit. We've seen it in other ways in other European states. And this doesn't seem to me to have gone away. I think it's also connected to the financial crash of 2007. I think it's exposed fault lines in terms of equity, economic equity, social equity, and so forth, globally, not just in the Middle East. And I think governments are struggling to deal with this. But the only way in which you can deal with it, with these challenges, is through the power of the nation state. I don't think it's gone away. I don't think there's any other way of organizing societies and economies in a way that serves the interest of the majority of the people in that community, other than a nation state. And this search for these transnational ideologies, for some sort of global solution, I might even say for some sort of pan-European solution, for me is an illusion. And that's the challenge we face.
And welcome to you. And thank you very much. And Ambassador Menon, please.
Thank you, John. I'm not sure what I should speak about. He spoke about violence. He spoke about the rise of China, which is the dragon. So what does that leave me with?
The sex.
Exactly. No, but let me build on what John was saying. It seems to me that when you we talk of the global arena, it's no longer one arena. I think what we are watching now is actually the end of the global order, I wouldn't use the word liberal because it wasn't always liberal for everybody under it, but there was one global order after the Second World War, and one political order and one economic order, and that's fragmented, both of them. The economic order after the unipolar moment, after that big wave of 2 decades of globalization, out of which everybody did well. I mean, China did best, but India was, the second largest beneficiary of that. But after the crisis of 2008, I think that's the end of that order. You've seen what's happened. And when you look at it politically from India, for instance, east of us, India and east of us, it's still a Westphalian order. All the problems are between states, the maritime disputes. There is contested commons, whether it's the high seas, cyberspace, and so on. But basically, it's between states. It's security dilemmas between states. China does something, India feels threatened, India builds up, China responds to it, Japan, China, you name it. West of us, it's a pre-Westphalian world that we see. It's non-state actors that we have to deal with. What's coming at us from the west of us, from Pakistan westward, unfortunately, is, and you go even further, you go to Europe, it's really a post-Westphalian world. I mean, Europe is busy arguing about how much sovereignty they're willing to see. The British want to take it back. Can they take it back? Even that's a question. How will they manage, etc. So from our point of view, actually, when we look at it where we are, somewhere in where all these fault lines seem to meet, really the political order is fragmented. The economic order is fragmented as well. The US has pulled out of TPP. Our CEP has now ended up as the only game in town in the Asia-Pacific. And that's going to be a whole separate set of economic arrangements. WTO hasn't managed a global agreement on trade now ever. I mean, the last agreements you did were pre-WTO. So you don't have an economic order. When we look west of us, as I said, what we're dealing with is really these are not just state breakdown, because in many places there never was a classical Westphalian state operating in large areas of the Middle East. You're really dealing with individual actors and what's coming out of them. So how do you deal with this? And this brings me to what you were saying about if you see all these threats, this high level of uncertainty, you see power transition you see a shifting balance of power. Do you deal with the threats in order in which they do the most damage to you? Or do you deal with the threats which actually give you an opportunity to change your life? There's a difference between the two. Frankly, you have to do both, but where do you put your effort? And how do you rank your threats? And this is an impossible exercise. When you sit where we are, facing basically international terror coming across our borders, and we see the increasing influence of ISIS in our neighborhood, luckily not yet in India, to the extent that we can't handle it. Or do you actually deal with the fragmenting political and economic order, which if you do solve will make a huge difference to your life? You have to deal with those political and other security challenges if you want to continue to grow and maintain your prosperity. Even if you solve that terrorism problem, it's not going to change your people's life very much. So where do you draw that line? And each state, unfortunately, draws that line differently. China today spends more on internal security than she does on external defense. In the Indian case, we'll spend more time on actually pacifying our periphery and making sure that we have a peaceful environment in which to continue to grow at 6% as we have for the last 30 years, because that's what our people need first. We need to concentrate on changing our own. And we're not going to spend effort on trying to build a global order. None of us, none of these rising or emerging powers want to actually change the order. What they want is to have a bigger say in it. We're not revanchists.
That's change.
No, that's only improving. And there's a big difference between wanting to improve the order from which you think you are the biggest beneficiaries to wanting to overthrow the order, which is what you were talking about. So I think there's a risk when we lump everyone together. We say there's a liberal, international, Western order which everybody else is going to try and overthrow. I don't think that's true. The Chinese are not trying to overthrow it. When they were asked in 2008 by the Russians, let's crash the dollar and let's crash the US economy. I mean, ask Paulson, he'll tell you. The Chinese said, no, we're not going to do that because that order works for us. Besides, they had their money tied up in the dollars.
Of course.
There's no question. But the fact is that each one has a different, and you have today, therefore, a completely fragmented situation. Is that terrible? No. Actually, it gives you an opportunity for a country like Israel, India, China, anybody, a larger country with a sense of its own agenda and an idea of where it wants to go. In a sense, this kind of disruption opens up the possibility of new allies, of working it out. For smaller countries, I can see why it's a problem. It would frighten the wits out of them, the uncertainty.
Everybody's afraid. I'd like to ask you a question and then widen it up. How much do you think a country, even India, not to mention Israel, has real say, real control over its destiny in these days? You're talking about nation states, fine, but even the United States cannot dictate anything, not to mention other countries.
Look, I come from a generation which knows what having no control and being poor and weak is. So if you ask me, do you have control? I have more control today over my life than I've ever had before.
Okay.
And that is true of Israel, certainly. There's no existential threat to our countries today. We have a degree of control which we've never enjoyed before. That's not true of the US anymore. Okay. Because for the first time, the US faces peer competition in certain parts of the globe. Okay. I mean, in South China Sea and so on.
So I'd like to ask you, Dr. Wallander, continuing what Ambassador Menon said, we take for granted, because that's the world we lived in, that you know that the United States, the West, controlled the world for the last, you can argue, 400 years since Columbus or whatever. But there's nothing, genetical about it. There's nothing that dictates that this should be the order. 300 years ago, China and India were 2/3 of the GDP of the world. Why shouldn't they want to have their, well, I do not like to quote the Kaiser, their place under the sun?
Well, first of all, I think the United States led the global order really beginning after World War II. So the United States, before that it was Britain and other
sure.
imperial powers.
No, I'm talking about the West.
So
Western
the West,
ideology,
the West.
Western
I don't think the problem.
commerce.
I agree that China is actually seeking to fit within the existing order, whether we want to call it liberal, the global order, right? And that India certainly is as well. I was highlighting Russia, though, as not accepting that order. And I think what really matters in that, or maybe what distinguishes the Russian leadership, perhaps, but I would welcome the conversation, for the Russian leadership, the existing global order is now seen as a threat to its ability to control its power inside. So the part of geopolitics that doesn't help you is understanding what are the national interests pursued by a country. And in an autocratic regime, they may not be the national interests determined by the geopolitical context. They tend to be the interests of the regime in power. And the Putin regime has set up a domestic political economic system in which integration in the international system, foreign investment, property rights, transparency, all these sorts of elements that go along with that global order, which advantage certainly American companies, but so far are also benefiting Chinese companies, those are actually seen as a threat to the ability of the Russian leadership to control its and hang on to power inside. And so in the last couple of years, the intervention in Ukraine, the intervention to save the Assad regime is not necessarily about some high-flying geopolitical national interests of Russia, but it's actually a national interest defined in terms of regime interests to prevent regime change, because the Kremlin sees itself as the next target if there is regime change in this region or elsewhere. And so I think that this brings up another point which I want to introduce, which is I think the Russia-China strategic partnership that a lot of at least Americans are obsessed and worried about is really overblown. Because I think exactly, in addition to the sort of geopolitical interests that Russia and China may not share, there is a different stake in that order and whether to try and shake it and break it, which is, I think, what the Russian leadership is trying to do, as opposed to the Chinese approach, which has been to try to steer the aircraft carrier, move it in a different direction by joining on with it. And so I very much agree with you.
Don't you think perhaps that, of course, there is no, like the saying in the 50s, the Soviet Chinese monolith, which never existed. But there are some ways, I think, where the Chinese are very happy to bad, evil Putin, put him, he's the one to get all the blame from the West, and they are doing very quietly some very sophisticated moves behind.
I think that's right. And I've often said when I'm talking to Americans who worry about the China-Russia relationship, I actually say if there is sort of something going on there, I think China is the country that's gaining the advantage, whether it's energy deals, managing the UN Security Council, managing the United States. And I'd be a lot more worried about that relationship if I was responsible for China policy in the United States than I really was when I was responsible for Russia policy. I don't think you can discount it,
Sure.
because it does affect policy from day to day, and it is a constant struggle to try to get through the kinds of UN Security Council resolutions that deal with sources of instability, that deal with weapons of mass destruction, that deal, for example, with Syria's chemical weapons program and get the Syrian regime to be held accountable for that program. But in a big strategic sense, I definitely think the evidence so far is that the Chinese leadership is playing that relationship much more skillfully and to its advantage than Russia has.
I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Jenkins, you talked before about the nation state, and we are, of course, in the 100th year of the Balfour Declaration, and of course the Bolshevik Revolution, etc. We are obsessed with the sanctity of borders. We are extremely afraid all around the world to open this specific and horrible Pandora box. Perhaps, and the Middle East is a good example or a very bad example, we should think that things shouldn't be as they were, you know, in Europe from Westphalia in some places and others. Perhaps borders should be opened up, and we should not, you know, relive the dreams and nightmares of old colonialists in Berlin in 1878 of, you know, partition of the subcontinent and what have you.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
Can it be done?
Well,
or should it be done?
You know, people. There's this whole narrative out there about borders in the Middle East, borders being artificial. I mean, every border, in a sense, is artificial. I just think it's a distraction. And if you look at 2007, the Iraqis won the Asia Football Championship, and everybody in Iraq for about 2 minutes stopped shooting each other and celebrated, because there was a sense this was an Iraqi national victory. And Iraq is one of the states that classically is said to be an artificial colonial creation. I don't think anybody in this region wants to change their borders. If you look at what people in Syria, in Iraq, what they're fighting to protect is what they conceive of as national territory. I think this notion that in some sense if you redraw borders, you get a more rational arrangement of communities, is actually quite dangerous. One of the things that the Islamic State want to do, for example, is to create a set of monocultures.
Sure.
So what you want to do is expel all the people you don't think belong within these borders you create for yourself, keep all the people in that you want to keep in, if necessary by force, and that becomes a new thing. You get this, and you get a rearrangement of borders, for example, in Syria. People have talked about federalization in Syria. You will get a recipe for endless conflict, endless irredentist conflict. You change borders, you will get irredentism.
You could argue that the opposite is true as well. You created federal states or non-states in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, so you delayed the inevitable conflict by 70 years. But it happened.
But I don't think. I mean, people talk about these as being age-old ancient. They're not age-old ancient conflicts. They're very modern, in some cases, postmodern conflicts. And I think what this does reflect, though, is this issue of identity politics.
Sure.
And we live in an age of identity politics.
Okay.
Identity politics, in the end, are also toxic. If they're mono-identity, identity politics. One of the distinguishing features of a successful nation state is that people within that state can hold several different identities at the same time, but still recognize that they have a shared national identity and shared interests. We see this in the UK. Look at what's happening with Scotland. You see it all across this region. This is not to say the borders are not porous. Borders, of course, are porous. They always have been porous. Sure. That's how people do trade. It's how the Islamic State did trade into Turkey, actually across internal borders with the Syrian regime. And if you look at and there are limits to how far national governments can control everything that happens, because of course trade is we're not going to see the end of globalized trade. And one thing I wanted to raise as well is energy markets, because one of the other things that we're seeing, and I think particularly in this region, but not just in this region, I think this is going to be global. I think we're seeing a secular shift in global energy markets. Mm-hmm. Every time Khalid Al-Faleh, who's the Minister of Energy, Economy and everything else in Saudi Arabia at the moment, says that he thinks oil prices are going to rebalance at a more sensible price, a more sensible level, which he means higher, towards $60 a barrel this year, the oil price falls. This morning it was $45. And I think this what we're seeing is the end of an era in which even cartels that control 40% of global supply, which is what OPEC did, are now cannot manage these particular global flows. Sure. This does not mean that borders are irrelevant or the national governments are irrelevant. It means they need to get better at managing the economic and social consequences of this.
Thank you. Ambassador, you would like to relate?
Boundaries, I wanted to say something. There isn't a boundary in the world which is where it was 200 years ago. Not even the US-Canadian boundary is where it was. There's a distinction to be drawn here, maybe. Just about. But there's a distinction to be drawn here between borders, which is really a zone where different nations, civilizations, cultures, whatever, interact, and boundaries, which is these artificial lines we draw on the map, as John said rightly. And those boundaries are not going to stay if they don't reflect power relationships, if they don't reflect the actual balance of power. That's just a fact. That's reality. So for me, this argument, as John said, this is an irrelevance to go on arguing about boundaries and where we draw the line on the map, knowing that this is impermanent. What you really need to do is to make sure that those borders stay peaceful and secure and safe, and that the places where cultures, nations, whatever, states interact, where they do trade, travel, all these things, that those are managed properly. And that's a completely different argument from, oh, was Sykes right, Sykes-Picot, what do we do with this, what do we do with that? And frankly, the world's biggest boundary dispute is India-China, 93,000 square kilometers. And yet, there hasn't been a shot fired in anger since 1975. And it's completely peaceful. Both sides have agreed to keep it as it is, maintain the status quo. It helps that it's 18,000 feet above sea level and nobody can live there. But, but the fact is it's peaceful because we both agreed how to manage it. And that's the way to go, it seems to me, rather than getting caught up in these legal arguments. There's too many lawyers involved in international relations.
Ambassador Jenkins talked about identity politics, and we all agree up to a point that I think that this is one of the driving forces in internal politics. We know it in Israel all too often, and the United States politics, of course, and all around the world. Do you adhere, Ambassador Menon, in some way or another to the old and often attacked, not so old, clash of civilizations theory? You think that there are perhaps some forces, European Union, the United States, the West, so to speak, China, India, Russia, etc., that are fighting or competing, maybe not for dominance, but again, for their proper place up the ladder of the international order?
No, I don't think there's any clash of civilizations going on here, frankly. And I think these are really artificially created modern identities which are creating narratives to justify themselves, most of these so-called clashes of civilizations. And these same civilizations have lived together in the past, they've fought, they've lived together again in peace. And the historical record doesn't prove any consistency or any pattern of a clash of civilizations. I think what matters here is, it seems to me, is the way in which we are creating identities and ethnicities and creating the sense of inevitable conflict. And this is a function of modern society, of technology, of what it does, and of the political demands that, today's political systems place on people to build constituencies, to create. But that doesn't mean that it's inevitable or that it can't be handled. And certainly not if you look through the rest of Asia. I mean, it's not.
Dr. Wallander, I'd like to take you to Russia, the big agitator these days. The greatest diplomat, for my money, ever lived, Talleyrand, once said that Russia is never as strong as it seems and never as weak as it seems. How come that it seems that poor, economically weaker Russia can generate power not less than, and in some places more than, the old mighty USSR?
Well, it's a great question, and I think there's two ways to think about it. One is that sort of a time dimension. I think there's no, and I would never argue that Russia should be discounted, and that it is incapable of acting and influencing global politics in general, and certainly specific issues or crises such as in Syria. Or it has enormous resources in Central Asia. It has a substantial air force and an increasingly capable air force. Of course, it has renewed its strategic nuclear capabilities, and it's extending actually its capabilities across the entire spectrum of the military, whether that's conventional, nuclear, or in new domains, including cyber and space. So that is given, and that's been the result of a deliberate policy and investment by the Russian leadership over the last 10 years. So it's military power connected with political strength at home and ability to prevent any dissenting views on how to use limited Russian resources and putting those resources into that military capability, and then really improving the ability of the Russian military to intervene. In the past 10 years, this didn't happen overnight. This is a result of investment in exercises and training and changing how the Russian military was organized, deployed. We are seeing the fruits of a very substantial change in policy that the Putin leadership began in the early 2000s.
And of course, vacuum by American presidents, especially Barack Obama.
Well, and in the context of a Russia that was supposed to have bought into that integrative policy, integrating into the global system, living by the rules of the international system, following international law, implementing arms control treaties. And then what you got in the last couple of years is a Russian leadership that has now rejected that structure, is violating arms control treaties, has violated some of the basic norms and actually rules of the UN Charter. And the borders may be artificial, I agree with you, and I often point that out to Russians themselves when they tell me Crimea has always been Russian. Actually, it hasn't always been Russian, and much of the Russian, almost everything of the Russian Federation once belonged to someone else, so be careful what you start. Because those systems of not changing borders by force, not that they're sanctified, but they can be changed, but through negotiation, through international law. But by shaking that, Russia has really undermined that order. And I will just make that, I want to go.
Are they a radical force? Are they, these days, is Russia a force that's trying to disrupt and perhaps topple the current world order?
I don't think Russia is trying to disrupt for the sake of disruption. It is unhappy. The Russian leadership is not happy with the constraints of the existing international system because they see them as a threat to their internal rule. That is why the Russian leadership would like to go back to a 19th century interpretation of international law, not because the 19th century was all that great for Russia, actually, but because it precluded, at least in the Russian imagination, the presumption of sort of the right to protect, of the notion that the issue of human rights could be a legitimate issue of conversation in the international community, the notion that you should have to respect foreign investment and not necessarily control it and be able on a whim to expropriate it. So I don't think it's disruption for disruption's sake. It's a sense that the existing order isn't working for us, and we're gonna break the dishes and try and come up with something that fits what the Russian leadership thinks fits better.
And they succeed with it.
They succeed with it, but that's the distinction I wanted to make, that over the long run, over the long run, they're playing, I think, a losing game. Sure. Because that's the third element. So there's military power, there's political control and governance and the ability to implement your policy. But the foundation of any country's national power is its economy. And the very policies that the Russian leadership and the very global system that is the source of increasing Chinese strength and hopefully continuing American strength and certainly European strength is exactly the force that Russia is risking by shaking that order, because it's not just a human constructed order of international institutions, it's that global economy where growth, opportunity, innovation, and the development of the economy lies. And the Russian leadership is actually cutting itself off from that long-term source of Russian power.
And if we're talking about economy and the state, Ambassador Jenkins, again, I'll start with a quote. I want to sound very wise. I think it was Tocqueville that said that the most dangerous time for a bad regime is when it starts to do reforms. These days in the Middle East, from the King of Morocco to Saudi Arabia, we see all kinds of very quick reforms. They try to reform the governments, to show that they are working for the people. They reform the economies. Can it work, or the whole building will come crashing down, especially Saudi Arabia, if we look at Saudi Arabia versus Iran?
Yeah, it was Tocqueville about autocracies. One of the other great drivers of change is demography. The Middle East, the Arab Middle East in the 1930s had 60 million people in it. It's got nearly 400 million people now. And by 2030, which is when, of course, the Saudis say that their reform program will be complete, there'll be something like nearly 500 million people in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia itself in the 1950s had 3 million, and now it has 20 million Saudis and 10 million expatriates. And this is across the Middle East. You see it in Egypt, which in the 1920s had about 25 million people. It's now got 100 million people. That drives a lot of this urge for reform. And in the end, the thing that the Middle East and the states of the Arab Middle East, and indeed Iran, have failed to do over the last 30 to 40 years is provide enough jobs to keep up with the very fast population growth rates that they've got. They know this, which is why they're now all talking about reform. And in Saudi Arabia, of course, they're seeking to implement this. I think, and we've just seen, of course, the replacement of the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Nayef leaving and Mohammed bin Salman coming in. It's a high-risk strategy, not least because the ability of any of these states to execute effective policy in a sustained way over a multi-year period is, how do I put this, untested. The trouble is, what's the alternative? People have been talking about the need for economic reform and other sorts of reform in the Middle East, but particularly economic reform, for decades. There have been, I think, 4 or 5 year plans in Saudi Arabia since the 1960s, apart from this one. They all got abandoned in the end. I mean, 5 year plans generally are a very bad idea. They took it from the Soviet model, of course, but they're very bad. It's a very bad idea. Now they want to do it in a rush. And it's at a time when the ideological challenge that they face from various forms of mobilized, insurgent, dissident, and often violent Islamisms is greater than at any time in their modern history. It's also a time when the tensions and hidden conflicts among the states of the Middle East have come out into the open. We're also seeing an age of perhaps of a new realism, a new realpolitik in security terms in the Middle East, combined with all this. You know, I think it's a huge ask. I don't know what the alternative is. I don't think there is an alternative. I think and I don't think the Middle East is an example of the Thucydides trap or anything like this. They're all essentially non-status quo, or they're all becoming non-status quo actors, and that's unique in the modern history of the Middle East.
If you had to put your money, would you say that out of the, let's say, kingdoms, from Morocco through Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, etc., one of them at least will not be here in its present form in 10 years from now, even 5 years from now? The regime, not the country.
I'm Catholic. I don't gamble.
Sure you do. On eternal...
oh, no, that's a certainty.
Okay.
You know, I remember giving a lecture at Yale about 4 years ago about political reform in the Middle East, and saying the place you're going to have you need to look for political reform isn't Egypt, isn't the traditional Republican state. It's the Gulf. If you look at surveys of Arab youth, consistently the country that they want their country to be like, the country they want to go and live in, or go and work in, is the United Arab Emirates. This seems to me to be very striking. This is essentially a deep security state with a liberal social and economic superstructure on the top. A lot of people hate it. A lot of Arabs love it. And I think that's actually an interesting model. I think that's actually where Saudi Arabia wants to go. I think it's more difficult for Saudi because it's a much bigger place. It's a more unwieldy place. And it's got itself involved in these various disputes, conflicts with others. It's high risk. I just don't see what the alternative is. They'll all still be here.
Okay. Okay. I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Menon, completely, and now to something completely different, as the great Monty Python used to say, values, or let's say, talking about values, you know, there is, these days, nobody will talk about imposing its values anymore, although I must say, and again, it's not politically correct for me to say it, when the British, let's say, forced India to stop the sati, or stop the British fleet, stopping the slave trade, there was something good in it. These days, we return to the cynical discussion of, you know, better have him with us than against us. He's a bastard, but he's our bastard, etc., etc. Is there a place for values, whatever they are, in the global arena these days?
I think there is, but it comes in a very strange way. It comes because regimes need legitimacy. Mm-hmm. And the only way they get legitimacy is from values, ultimately. John made an interesting point about demography and its effects, its political effects. And it has very different effects in different places. If you look at China, by 2040, at the rate they're going, China's age structure will be like Japan's today. And Japan's the grayest major country in the world. I have no doubt that China seeks primacy in the world and would like a world order centered around China. But if they want to do it, they have to do it now. They have to do it quickly, before they get too old to be.
These are not encouraging words, by the way.
Wait. So what happens? You see a reliance, because the old ideologies no longer work. The state, therefore, relies increasingly on nationalism. There's patriotic education campaigns. There's this whole idea of the great rejuvenation of China. It's the same as Make America Great Again. It's the same appeal, basically. In India, demography works the other way. We have a huge demographic dividend. At the rate we're going, we have a domestic market which will keep trend growth rates up, but we also need to produce 11 million jobs every year for people who are joining the market. So we will focus internally, and we will use the external world to try and solve that problem rather than the other way around. So it doesn't drive us out. It doesn't drive up the nationalism. It's a different... Now, where do you get legitimacy then? You have to go back to your values. In India, you'd go back to your democracy. Where is the government? In the Chinese case, you can't go back to socialism, communism. You go to nationalism. But at some stage, they will have to start talking about values that appeal to the rest of the world. If they need the rest of the world,
they talk about Confucianism.
Yeah, but it's not quite what... We've had 5 definitions of Confucianism over history. I mean, the Sung dynasty did Neo-Confucianism in the 11th century. That's a long time ago. And so now you've got Neo-Confucianism. I mean, this is...
It's like Judaism, same thing.
Yeah, but you can use it, but there are limits to how far this Confucianism works. They will need to find universal values if they want to run a global order. And they will have to base it on values which other people will also accept.
And not only internally, if you go to your allies.
You look at who wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Do you...
if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who wrote that document? Americans, yes, but also Indians, Brazilians. I mean, you got Europeans who had just come out of the worst war possible. You got people from across the world to write this. And it's incredible. There's a really nice book, actually, saying which bits came from whom. And until you can do that, you don't have legitimacy. And you can't claim to run an international order or actually have the kind of soft power that the US has enjoyed so far. Today, the fact that the US doesn't seem to want it anymore, that's their business. But that's a different argument.
But I'd like to continue with a question of values, but in the international arena. At some point, Israel said, and says it even today, we are alone practically, and if somebody is for us, then we close our eyes and look the other way at South Africa during the apartheid years, or Argentina during the junta years, which America, the United States, did as well. Supported all kinds of evil regimes. Do you say these are our allies and we are for them because we need them? Or do you say, okay, from time to time I lecture my allies, I even break up with them because I cannot support this regime anymore? Is there a place for that in this cynical world?
I think you have to be a realist and deal with reality as you find it, but that doesn't mean you don't try and change it. And I think it also, if you try and do it without any values at all, it actually makes your policy much less effective. So it's really a choice of how effective do you want to be. If you might be effective today, but without values, you won't be effective tomorrow, and you won't be able to carry other people with you.
You want to add?
So bring this back to Game of Thrones. So the lesson most people take from Game of Thrones is that life is nasty, Brutus, and short, and you have to be willing to stab anyone in the back and fight anyone and trust no one and be bloodthirsty. But actually, the lesson of the Game of Thrones is if you do that in Westeros, you're in bad shape and everyone's being killed and no one's really in power. They're all kind of fighting with one another. And what's coming in season 7 is you have Daenerys Targaryen has built an alliance based on values and principle, plus she has dragons. Yeah, well, having an Air Force is always good, as the United States has learned, when you're going to lead a moral alliance. And Jon Snow is building an alliance in the north, you could say multi-ethnic, it includes giants. but also based on principles, on not simply exercising power, but having power and purpose and values and getting people to join with you because they believe in what you're doing. And I think that geopolitics lays out the reality. But if that's all we learn from history and from the difficulties we see, we actually are going to be powerless in being able to deal with these things. I'll speak for the United States, sort of, right here. Why you could argue that we haven't succeeded totally in Afghanistan. But for the period of time in which, during the Obama administration, we had more success against al-Qaeda and ramping and rolling up al-Qaeda's networks in Afghanistan, it wasn't because the United States was in Afghanistan. It was because the United States, with allies, was in Afghanistan, each contributing different pieces to the operation. Same thing with the U.S. operation in Syria against ISIS. It's the U.S., yes, it's the U.S. Air Force, but it's not only the U.S. Air Force. It's actually a coalition effort of countries that are not only frightened of ISIS and terrorism, but actually share values and are worried about the threat of terrorism not only to the life of their citizens, but to their countries and their way of life. And so I don't want to, I love the Game of Thrones. I don't want you to think I'm one of those people who thinks you have to go around stabbing everyone in the back. I mean, that's the way you'll win. That's the way you'll win, in season 1 and season 2. But in the end, you really want to have those values giving purpose to your power as well. And I think the lesson is pretty clear. And that's what I'm worried about. If the United States isn't there for that, I'm not saying no one else can do it, but we're not seeing who else is there.
I'll say two things about Game of Thrones. First, it's easier when you write the books and dictate who will win in the end. And second, my personal lesson from Game of Thrones: don't get emotionally attached to anybody over there. He can kill them all. I'd like to ask you, John, concerning this. From the country that invented Rudyard Kipling, the great game in Asia, etc., etc. Is geopolitics, after all, eternal in a way? Russia will always try to go to warm water. Who controls Asia, who controls the high seas, etc. Is geography and history behind everything, or are there modern forces that will put an end to that?
Well, somebody said geography is destiny. I think the going back to this issue, and it's an issue about soft power, because some things cross bound. Now, the issue of soft power and values are notoriously slippery things, because what we think of as our values now weren't our values 10 years ago. John Locke, the great English political philosopher, the father of liberalism, would have excluded Catholics, me, from his ideal republic. So it's dangerous talking about values. The issue about soft power is choice, individual, uncoerced choice. And if you look at the history of the post-war, post-Second World War world, more people have chosen the equivalent of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness than they've chosen the Chinese model of neo Confucian, subsuming yourself in a community. You have to be sure this is uncoerced choice, for me. And that means that you need to provide an environment in which uncoerced choice is possible, which brings me back.
But you can do it
back to Thomas
in the
Hobbes,
end by force.
Which brings me back to Thomas Hobbes, because Hobbes said, in contrast to the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, that there is one natural right, and that natural right is the right to self-preservation. And everything else, all of the subsidiary rights flow from this, which means the fundamental, the underpinning of all of this stuff we're talking about is security. And I come back to that point. And that's the fundamental duty of the nation state, to procure security. It's what we don't see in this region. It's what we don't see in Westeros, not maybe till season 7, the end of season 7. But it is absolutely essential. And I'm a Hobbesian.
Okay.
Let me add to that.
Yes.
The purpose of policy is to increase your options and to make sure that the only option left to your adversary is to do what you want, right? By your definition. Values help you to do that.
Okay, and we have 1 minute, so from each one of you, in a sentence, are you an optimist about where the world is heading these days? Given everything that we know from the best of time, Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. What is it?
So I think I'll quote, I didn't expect to do this, I'll quote my Secretary of Defense. who said, you know, give us Americans a chance. We'll exhaust everything, do everything wrong first, and once we've exhausted those options, we'll get it right. So yeah, I guess I am.
Okay.
There's a great Palestinian novel called The Adventures of Said the Pez Optimist. Said al-Mutasha'il. I'm a Pez optimist. I think I'm with Gramsci. I don't often quote Italian Marxists, but Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I think that's quite a good motto.
And you, Ambassador?
I am an optimist because I do think that we're going through a fundamental phase transformation, and that opens up huge opportunities for those who are clever enough and actually are willing to actually go out and take those chances.
You have to keep your nerve.
Oh, yes, always.
We all do.
Thank you very much. And after all, you have to remember winter is coming. Thank you very much, Dr. Wallander, Ambassador Menon, Ambassador Jenkins. Thank you very much.